Hey everyone, it's Patch 3.23 Affliction, and today I want to talk about Simulacrum farming. This is a strategy that I've been doing for the past few days, and I've been having quite a lot of success making a decent amount of money, especially in this current economy, through just doing Simulacrums. If you don't know what Simulacrums are, well, they're a very simple wave-based mini-game that gives you quite a variety of loot from a bunch of different league mechanics, and it's a very fun thing to do that quite a lot of builds are half decent at and can do very well in, where your clear and your tankiness are the two things that matter the most, and things such as movement speed aren't really that important. So for builds that have wonderful screen-wide clear and can be somewhat tanky, this is a very good way of making money, especially if your build doesn't have the highest mobility. Now, Simulacrums are an amazing alternative to mapping, an amazing alternative to different ways of playing the game, simply because all you need to do a Simulacrum is the Simulacrum itself, which is something you could buy from people, and it's something that people sell in large bulk typically, meaning you can buy yourself 20, 30 Simulacrums and just be ready to go and ready to do content that makes you a lot of money immediately without you needing to buy scarabs and compasses and roll your maps and worry about any of the other mapping supplies you might need. You simply just go buy yourself 10, 20 sims and you just go do some sims for the rest of the day. The other really nice thing about Simulacrums, which we'll talk about more in detail in a little bit, is the fact that most of the builds that you typically want to farm Simulacrums with are usually very tanky. So tanky to the point that they can literally just AFK and stand still in Simulacrums. And because they can do that, that means you can, and I'm not joking here, go watch a stream on the side or go watch a video or go binge your favorite Netflix series. The whole point of Simulacrums is that it's kind of a way for you to be able to play Path of Exile and make money while being able to do something else on the side. Simulacrums are not necessarily AFK, as you're going to have to loot every minute or so, and you're going to have to kill monsters around you. And the more efficient you are at killing monsters, the more money you're going to make. But you can very easily actually be able to just sit there and watch something on the second screen because you don't need to pay that much attention, especially if you're playing a Simulacrum oriented build that is very good in this one specific scenario. So with that out of the way, why don't we talk about everything we need to discuss? So the first thing I want to talk about is, well, the only thing that matters here is the build that you pick. There's no strategy, there's no atlas, there's no supplies, there's nothing you need other than to just buy Simulacrums from other people, which you could very easily do on the bulk website by simply picking that you have div orbs. And if you go to fragments and sets, you can just simply pick Simulacrums from here and you'll find yourself plenty of people selling Simulacrums. Now, personally, what I'd recommend is to potentially go over to the filters and put a minimum stock of a few. It doesn't have to be a very high amount, but just filtering out all the people who have one or two Simulacrums will allow you to get yourself some Simulacrums substantially faster, as you won't have to do a bunch of trades with people, and instead you can just buy all your Simulacrums from one person. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that Simulacrum prices are a little bit volatile, especially since right now a lot of people are figuring out that Simulacrums are very good money per hour. So you might see Simulacrums be worth about a divine per right now, but even at a divine per, you're making more than enough money to justify the cost of it. So let's talk about the Simulacrums themselves. So the Simulacrums are going to be very simple. You're going to be put in a deliriumified version of one of the towns from Acts 6 through 10. Now, what is going to happen inside of these deliriums is you are going to have a mysterious figure that is going to allow you to start each wave. Simulacrums are a wave-based activity that go from wave 1 to 30, where the further you go, the harder it gets. The main scaler for difficulty here is going to be Delirious Effect. And Delirious Effect is just a way to classify how much delirium is in a current area at a given time. The higher this value is, the more damage the monsters are going to do and the less damage they're going to take. When we're up into 100% delirium, which is the maximum it can go, and that is the delirium that you're going to have to be dealing with for waves 20 to 30, which are the hard part of delirium, monsters are going to take 80% less damage. So if we come into Path of Building, you can actually very easily see just how good your build would be in Delirium by just simply going into the enemy stats section, the config of your build, and just simply choosing the Delirious Effect. Realistically, you don't care about 20 to 80 that much because you're only going to be in that portion of a Simulacrum for a very short amount of time, and that's not where most of the loot comes from. You're going to want to check your 100% Delirious DPS. As you can see here in this build that I have 2 million Lightning Arrow DPS in, my Lightning Arrow towards the end of Simulacrums is only going to do about 400,000 DPS. Now, personally, what I would recommend as the absolute minimum DPS that you should do at 100% Delirious is to be somewhere around 1 to 2 million. If you can do 3, 4, 5 million and higher 100% Delirious DPS, you'll be more than fine and have more than enough DPS. But anything below a million is going to feel really bad, especially once you encounter the bosses. Both Kosas and Omni are going to feel extremely bad to attempt to kill with less than a million DPS, especially if one of the waves that you're doing also ends up rolling with modifiers that make you do less damage. Things such as reduced damage taken from crits, resistance resistance to your damage type, more monster life, and things like that. But as long as you have a few million damage, Sims should not be too bad. As I mentioned, Sims go from wave 1 through 30, where the delirious effect is going to scale all the way up to 20, and then 20 to 30 are effectively bonus rounds / the actual difficult part of Simulacrum, where your build is going to really be tested. For the first 10 waves or so, you don't really notice you're fighting monsters, as it should be as easy as about a white to yellow map. Waves 10 through 20 are going to ramp up a little bit more here and there, and around wave 16 to 17, you'll start noticing the difficulty ramping up really fast, all the way up to 20, and at 20, you'll finally feel how Simulacrums actually feel. Now, that said, delirious effect is not going to be the only difficulty scaler that you're going to have to deal with. The other thing you're going to have to keep in mind is that these waves will have random modifiers on them as well, and these modifiers are going to stack up and get more extreme the later you get into a Simulacrum. Yes, delirious effect stops scaling by wave 20, but from waves 20 to 30, you are going to get additional modifiers added every few rounds, meaning by the time you get to wave 30, there are going to be quite a lot of monster modifiers on your wave, making wave 30 substantially harder than wave 20, unless you luck out and most of the modifiers don't really affect you or apply to the monsters in a meaningful way. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that none of these modifiers will break you. You'll never have to worry about modifiers saying reflect, or you never have to worry about modifiers saying reduced chance to poison or ignite. None of these modifiers are build breaking modifiers, and all of them typically are either monster life, monster crit chance, reduced damage taken from crits, more monster resistances, things like that. Things are either going to make everything do more damage, or things are going to make them take less damage. But never have to worry about anything build breaking like no leech or no regen or really stupid mods like that. Now, if you are new to Simulacrums, or if you aren't going to have a very put together build, that's okay. You don't need to finish a full Simulacrum to actually profit from this. Sims at the time making this video are about a divine each, and typically within the first 10 waves or so, you're going to make that divine back. If you can make it to about wave 20 or so, and you die and lose all of your portals by wave 20, you should be making a few div in profit, and if you can make it halfway through waves 20 to 30, you should get the majority of the money, but obviously you want to be able to go all the way to 30. What I'm trying to say here is, if you have a weaker build, you can still try out Simulacrums, do your best in them, get as much money as you can out of them, and then use that money to upgrade your build further to be able to go further and further into Simulacrums until you can eventually comfortably clear wave 30. This is very much not an activity where you have to clear wave 30 to see any profit, and you'll still be able to make quite a decent amount of money just getting as far as you can, assuming you can make it past wave 10 to 15, as anything below that really just isn't worth your time. And if you can't consistently make it to about wave 20, I would really recommend to come back later once you have more gear. Outside of that, we will talk about all the loots and all the profit further on this video. But up next, what I want to talk about are these Simulacrum builds themselves. So Simulacrum kind of has its own meta. There are quite a lot of requirements to stats that you need to be able to do Simulacrums very comfortably. The first thing I want to mention is Ailment Immunity. You cannot do Simulacrums without Ailment Immunity. Simulacrum and Delirium in general have alternative ailments that can get applied to you on top of the normal ailments. So what I mean by that is the alternative to chills and freezes is Brittle. And what Brittle does is effectively Assassin's Mark on you, which means monsters have flat critical strike chance against you. And what that means is if you were to go against a Brittle and crit multi-wave, you will just randomly get one shot very often, which means Brittle is just an absolute brick. There's also Scorch, the alternative ailment to Ignites, which are going to reduce your resistances by quite a lot, which means you can very easily not be res capped anymore if you get a big Scorch on you. And lastly, we have Sapped, which is the alternative to Shock. And what Sap does is it makes you do less damage, meaning you can just all of a sudden lose 30% of your damage. Not only that, but these monsters are going to ignite, shock, and chill and freeze you very often, making ailments an absolutely deadly part of Simulacrums that you need to have Ailment Immunity for. There's simply no way around it. If your build cannot fit in Elemental Immunity, or if you don't have Element Immunity, just don't even try doing Sims. You'll have an awful time. Next up are some stats that I really recommend you should add into your build, or your build should have, but are not necessarily all required. And the first stat I really want to mention here is Evasion Rating. So Simulacrums are not monster level 84. Instead, they are monster level 75, and as you go further and further into Simulacrum, a modifier is applied to all the monsters, making them drop loot at a level higher, which means eventually they will drop loot equivalent to monster level 84 monsters, but the point is they are monster level 75 by default, which means they'll have monster level 75 stats. And the one thing that we care about here is evasion rating and the enemy's accuracy rating. So if you look in Path of Building, the enemy level that Path of Building compares you to is equivalent to your level up to monster level 84, and that's just set to a default to monster level 84 as soon as you go over level 84. As we can see here on this character with 30,000 evasion rating, I have an 82% chance to evade an attack from a monster level 84 monster. Well, because Simulacrums are monster level 75, I would go from an 82% chance to evade up to an 87% chance to evade, which is a massive difference. That means my evasion is effectively substantially stronger in a Simulacrum than it is anywhere else. Which means even if you can just fit in a level 20 Grace into your build, you will get a lot of evasion rating out of it, and it'll be a massive defensive layer, especially against the lower level monsters. If you don't know how big of a difference 80 to 87 evasion rating is, it's the same thing as spell suppression, where the difference between 90% spell suppression and 100% spell suppression is absolutely massive. Going from 80 to 87% evasion rating effectively means I'm going to take somewhere around 40% less auto attacks than I was with 80% chance to evade. It's the same thing as stacking more maximum elemental resistance. Each percent of maximum elemental resistance on top of the previous one just gets better and better and better. So a little bit of evasion rating goes a long way. If you can't fit a Grace into your build, try potentially fitting in a Jade Flask, because that'll help you quite a bit as well, and try to get yourself an evasion rating suffix on one of your flasks as well. Even just a Jade Flask will go a long way, and it should be substantially stronger than armor, for example. Outside of that, another really good defensive layer is reduced damage taken from crits. This is sad that people don't really talk about many builds, but it's unbelievably powerful in making you tankier, and in my opinion is going to make a massive difference in terms of keeping you alive in Simulacrums. Most builds should feel pretty good in Sims, but randomly, you might just be suddenly one-shot due to a Sim wave having 100% extra as cold and 100% extra as lightning, and then having enemies penetrate 12% of your resistances. You can get really, really bad mods stacking together like that, making some Sim waves unbelievably rippy, and if you have a rippy wave like that, and then you take a big hit that also ends up critting you, you will just fall flat on your face and die very quickly. So because of that, if you can fit in a little bit of crit damage reduction, it's going to go a long way. Typically, ways you can fit this in is through Defiance Banner. Defiance Banner is going to give you about 40% reduction, which is already a massive amount. And if you can't stack anymore, that 40% is going to go a very long way. You get 30% on a Critical Strike Mastery. You can get 50% as a Chest Corrupt. You can get up to 30% as a Shield Corrupt. And lastly, you can get 30% on an Armor Mastery. I would really recommend to at least get one of those sources into your build, as most builds can fit one of those somewhere in, and ideally get at least two of them. If you get yourself at least 50, 60, 70% reduced damage taken from crits, that's going to make crits substantially less scary, and you're not going to really have to worry about them anymore. Moving on next, I would really recommend for you to get a lot of maximum elemental resistance, as there's going to be an unbelievable amount of elemental damage thrown at you during Simulacrums. This is where a lot of the scary damage comes from, and having a lot of armor doesn't really matter too much. It's going to be by far the most deadliest part of Simulacrums, behind crits and behind the alternative ailments. Now, ideally, if you can, if your build doesn't need specific flasks, it would be nice if you can fit in a ruby, a topaz, and a sapphire, as they go a long way into making you tankier. But if you can't, and all you can do is just get yourself some max res will go a long way as well. And lastly, chaos resistance. Chaos resistance is going to go a very long way here, especially since the two bosses, which are most likely going to be the things that kill you, both have innate physical as chaos damage conversion, and a lot of their abilities just do chaos damage. Not only that, but physical as chaos is a very common mod, and a lot of the enemies in there also just end up doing chaos damage themselves. Chaos damage is very prevalent in Sims, and it's going to be something that you actually need to pay attention to. It's not going to be something that you're going to want to leave at negative 60% as you do Sims. If you're playing a super tanky build, you could ignore your chaos res a little bit, but I would advise for all builds to at least have positive chaos resistance, and if possible to try and get yourself to 20-30% at a bare minimum. It will massively help you. It'll make you feel substantially more tanky while doing these Sims. Now, before we go any further, what I want to talk about next is how you actually get loot from Simulacrum. So as you kill monsters in a Simulacrum wave, you are going to build up the reward levels. These are going to be the same exact reward levels as if you were to do a daily mirror in a map. And at the end of the wave, once you've killed all the monsters, you will get loot from each of the different reward types based on how many levels you got. Partial levels do not matter. And for example, if you hit 6.5, there is no difference between that and just barely hitting 6. You need to hit whole reward levels to actually be rewarded for that. And because of that, we're going to have 3 separate tiers of builds that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about S tier builds, which are the builds that can hit reward level 7 every single time it's possible. Now, key thing there, when it's possible, because it's not going to always be possible to hit reward level 7. Reward level 7 is only possible for builds that can do 6.5 every single wave, and then that 6.5 will get pushed to 7 when you get a wave that has both bosses inside of it. If you do not have a wave that has Kosis and Omni, 7 is not possible, and it's only possible for a few waves towards the end of each Simulacrum. But the difference between not hitting reward level 7 and hitting reward level 7 is about 15% more currency per hour. So it's really important to hit reward level 7. Then we'll have the A tier characters. These will be characters that can hit reward level 6 very consistently, but have no chance of hitting reward level 7. These are also going to include some builds that can do 6, but only sometimes and maybe around 20 to 30% of the time, they end up only hitting reward level 5. And lastly, we'll have all the other builds in B tier. Now, realistically, most builds are going to fall in A tier. Very few builds are going to fall in B tier, and only a very, very few exclusive builds will actually qualify for S tier. Now, what I want to first talk about is going to be those S tier builds. Now, the S tier class of sim builds are going to be a very minor and very exclusive club. There are currently 4 builds that fit this criteria. The first one I want to talk about is a tried and tested build. We are going to be talking about EK Ignite. This is a build that is kind of squishy, but it's going to be very fast and it's going to blow up the screen. Not only is this a build that's good at all content in general, but it's absolutely a sim deleter. And this is originally what the build was designed for, as a sim deleter. But since then, this build has been adapted to be able to basically do all content with no problems. EK Ignite is a pretty cheap build to get into. And if you want to set up as a sim farmer, it won't take you more than about 50 to 60 div to get something that's a competent sim farmer that can do around wave 20 pretty easily. If you're going to want to push up to wave 30, you're probably going to have to throw about 100, 150 div into the build, or have a build that's worth about 50 to 60 to 70 div with a headhunter, as headhunter will go very hard in an EK setup and it'll massively carry its damage. Now, EK will struggle with the bosses a little bit, as it does rely on using explosions to get a very large amount of clear, and you won't see reward level 7 every single time until you get yourself an explodey bow much later into the build, but you will be able to see reward level 7 somewhat often without an explodey bow, but the explodey bow is what takes it to the next level. As you can see in the background footage here, I personally have played EK Ignite quite a bit and I love this build, and I have a whole build guide on it from 320 that will link in the description below. And while it's a few leagues old, it should be more than enough to get you going, and most of the information in there should be completely accurate, and it should be all you need to be able to get you going. Now, up next, another build I want to mention is going to be Neurotox's Kinetic Bolts of Fragmentation build. This is a build that he specifically set up for Simulacrums, and as you can see, is a little bit of an eye cancer build. This is also a very strong new sim farmer that has popped up recently, and I will say that I personally don't know how good this is myself, but he's been showing to be doing pretty well with it. As you can see here, it's doing a wave 30 Simulacrum with no problem other than not being able to see what is actually happening on the screen. I'll have a link in the description for this build as well, and personally, I feel like this is going to be a very strong build that has potential to be in the S tier category with everything else. And if you want to put this build together, it should be somewhere around 100 to 150 div to be able to get going at a competent rate at which you can farm Simulacrums with it fairly easily. Now, up next, we have Str Stacking Venom Gyre. Now, this is another tried and tested build for Simulacrums, and it's another build that is very much known to always hit reward level 7. There are plenty of guides on this, and I will try to find a decent one for you in the description, but I do want to warn you that this build is not cheap to put together. Str Stackers are always going to be very expensive, but they have shown to have very good results, and this is a really good build for just all content in general, and it's actually a really good deep delver if you're interested in deep delving as well. Overall, while this build might be very expensive, it should be able to get reward level 7 every time without too many issues. And finally, for the S tier builds, we have Spark. Now, Spark did get nerfed in Affliction, but even after the nerfs to Affliction, Spark is still an absolutely S tier build for Simulacrums, and it will absolutely tear through Simulacrums and give you reward level 7 every single time it's active. This build is going to take quite a little bit to get going, but Anime Princess has an absolutely wonderful guide on how to put this together and how to make a very competent setup, not just for Simulacrums, but for all content in general. That'll also be linked in the description below, but I do want to warn you that putting together a Spark setup that can do Simulacrums without many issues is going to cost many divs, and it's going to be a very endgame option. Realistically, no matter which of the S tier builds you're going to pick, I would recommend to at least go into them with about 100 div at a minimum. Otherwise, you are going to not be able to do wave 30. As I mentioned as well with EK, you can put it for a little bit cheaper, and the same goes for Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation. But realistically, no matter what, you're going to need to put quite a lot of money into these characters if you want them to perform at peak performance. By no means are any of the S tier builds just slap on 10C worth of gear and go laugh at wave 30 Simulacrums. These are just the best possible builds to farm Simulacrums with if you have a lot of currency. Up next, I want to talk about the A tier builds. Now, I'm going to split this into 2 classes, the A+ and the A-. The only difference here is really just going to be how tanky the build is and just how decent the build is in general for clearing. So for A+ tier, there's quite a lot of builds. I'm going to very quickly try rapid fire as many as I can, no particular order. But we have Metaforge Arrows, which is the build you're currently seeing in the background, and is the build that I've been playing for the past few days. We have Armor Stacker, both as Chieftain and as Scion, both as the Molten Strike version and the Smite version. We have Spectral Shield Throw, SRS, Arakali, Hex Blast, Bone Shatter, any cast and crit build, and Winter Orb. Now, all these builds are either just going to have really good clear, and they might give you a chance of hitting reward level 7 sometimes under ideal conditions, but should all basically always hit reward level 6 with no problems and always be able to either face tank everything in the cases of half those builds, or be able to delete everything so quickly that they don't really ever take much damage. As for the A- builds, we have things such as DD, RF, full builds, splitting steel, some minion builds, and a lot of the other just general decent AoE builds. Now, if I didn't mention your build here, I'm not saying that it's not good for Simulacrums. It's most likely going to be either A+ or A-, and there's very, very few builds that are going to be in the B tier. Realistically, the B tier is just kind of your build doesn't really have clear in it, so it's not really a build that can do Simulacrums. And some good examples of that might be something like a Bosser like Ice Spear Totems, or something like General's Cry. It's just the builds that straight up only are good at single target damage and aren't really made for AoE. But realistically, you are probably playing an A+ or an A- build that doesn't have any problems in Simulacrums. And again, the only difference between A+ and A- is that the A+ builds are really tanky and always can hit reward level 6 with not many problems. And the A- builds are typically builds that will sometimes hit reward level 6, but not necessarily always, and are probably still super tanky and have great clear. They just probably don't have enough damage or don't have enough money put into them. The whole point is, realistically, most builds, assuming you are somewhat tanky, should be more than fine and you should have no issues. And finally, as the last thing that I want to talk about in this guide for Sims is going to be the loot itself. So what I've done for this video is I've done 20 Simulacrums and taken all the loots that we've gotten during this 20 Simulacrums and put them in these 2 quad tabs. Now, obviously, I could have used a little bit of a bigger sample size. I could have gone to 40, 50, 60 Sims, but realistically, 20 should be more than enough, especially since I didn't really get very lucky and all of the loot that I got was very average, and this should be more than enough to just give you an average spread of all the loot that you got here. Now, the loot is going to be split into a few things. First, we're going to have the items that you're going to have to individually sell, which realistically, there are not going to be too many of. This typically consists of cluster jewels, any 2120s or 2020s, any sort of high-end gems that might be worth something. Split personalities, which is a unique drop from Simulacrum, and some of them can be worth quite a few divs, but a lot of them are just not going to be worth much, and you ideally probably don't even want to bother picking them up. Voices, which is another unique item from Simulacrums, which you really won't see too much of. And other than that, you might have random miscellaneous cards that might be worth 10, 20 chaos. You'll eventually get a few breach zones. You might get some unique maps. But realistically, the majority of this loot is going to be very easy to sell because it's just things that you can bulk. About half of the total loot and the total income that you're going to see during Simulacrums is going to be made up by both scarabs and essences, which are both things that you can very easily sell. All you're going to be doing while doing Simulacrums is just putting all of your loot away. And whenever you are ready to actually cash in and get all the money from your loot, all you have to do is just simply use TFT's bulk tool and just bulk sell all of your essences and all of your scarabs in one go, which should basically be half the loot just immediately gone. Outside of that, you're just going to get some really big stacks of items that shouldn't be too difficult to sell, especially since people would end up paying for them more in bulk. So as you can see here, this is all the currency that we got in 20 Simulacrums. And as you can see, the total loot in here comes out to 113 div. Now that is not the full story, as unfortunately PoE Stack has a few things in here that cannot actually be manually priced by PoE Stack. The majority of that is going to be some of the cluster jewels and the split personalities. Now, during my 20 Simulacrums, I didn't get too lucky in terms of loot, and I only got a few of the split personalities that are worth quite a lot of money. As you can see, here I got one that's worth about 6 div, and I did get decently lucky, and I ended up getting an Intelligence Mana split personality, which is worth about 10 to 11 div right now. Other than that, I did end up getting myself an Ignite Prolift, which is worth about 2 div for some reason right now, a few cluster jewels that are worth anywhere between 40 to 50 chaos each, and I did end up getting myself a 5 passive voices, which is worth 2 div. If you were to take all the extra loot in here that PoE Stack is not currently counting, which is about 27 div worth of total loot between these split personalities and between all the cluster jewels, our total loot comes out to about 140 div. Now that is not fully accurate because PoE Stack is a little bit off on some items, both overestimating and underestimating. So a good example here is the two-handed cluster that I end up getting, which PoE Stack currently values at 6.7 div, which is a little bit too high. I don't have it included in this total here, and if we did include it in here, it would go to 120, which means in total we would be at about 145 div from all of these Simulacrums. But currently that price is a little bit wrong. And if you look here, even these prices are wrong, as it's currently taking into account fractured ones as well. And since this is a clean base that someone would buy to fracture, it is worth about 6 divines currently and not 6.7. The other thing to mention as well is it's currently massively undervaluing strands. I specifically made sure to favor strands in all of my slots when I'm doing this because strands are currently worth, at minimum, for anyone who's selling 10 or more strands at once, 10 chaos or more. That means instead of us having 1.4 div in strands, we actually end up having 3.6 div in strands, meaning that this is currently undervaluing our strands by about 2 div. Another thing to mention as well, for example, are all the Mortal Ignorance pieces that we got. We end up getting 11 of them, and currently, PoE Stack thinks that these are about 60 C each. But realistically, if you're selling these for div rates, they are worth about half a div currently, not 60 C. Meaning instead, we have about 5 to 6 div worth of Mortal Ignorances alone, and the same goes for the other mortal pieces that we have. Lastly, it is currently over-evaluating things such as Splinters of Ulnatol, as these are not 3.8 C each and are a little bit closer to 2 C each, given that a full breach is worth 1 div right now. So if we take all that into consideration, and if we change numbers a little bit on all the things that's either overestimating or underestimating on, it actually ends up mostly canceling each other out, and the total is going to also come out to about 120 div or so. Now, again, take this with a little bit of grain of salt. You can either add 10 div to this or remove 10 div from this, however you want to put it. But when we add the 120 div with the 25 div worth of other items that currently PoE Stack is not pricing, we have about 145 div worth of total loot across our 20 simulacrums, which means if we were to divide it by 20, that means we made about 7.25 div per simulacrum on average. In my opinion, I think this is really great money. I feel like in the current economy, especially because you can just straight up AFK and stand there if you play yourself a Simulacrum build or play a very strong build in general. And if we assume you're doing about 2.5 simulacrums per hour, which should be reasonable, assuming you are paying attention and you're not going too slow, that means you're making about 18 div an hour consistently. Now, that is not the full story. One thing that I didn't mention here are all the cluster jewels currently worth an ungodly amount of money. And this is not for crafted items. This is just for the bases themselves. I didn't end up getting one here, but if you end up finding yourself a 12 passive 84 item level damage with bow skills cluster jewel, that is currently worth 44 divines just for the base itself. The same goes for 3 passive reservation efficiency. It's currently worth 35 div. There's also quite a lot of other high-end cluster jewels worth an unbelievable amount of money right now, and I ended up not really seeing any of these, even though these are very common. These should have about the same weighting as each other, with the only thing to be said here is that you'll be seeing less of the 84s than everything else, just because 84s don't start appearing until wave 20 or higher. But you have the same chance of getting a 84-12 physical damage cluster as you do an 84-12 bow damage cluster, meaning you have a very high chance, and you'll definitely see quite a lot of these if you do a lot of simulacrums, to get a high payout of 35 or 44 div, getting yourself a good cluster base. Another thing to mention as a big ticket item to look out of here are going to be split personalities. Now, this is a jewel that is going to randomly drop every time you kill Omniphobia in a wave, and it's going to have +5 to 2 random stats. This could be anywhere between accuracy rating, evasion rating, armor, strength, intelligence, dexterity, life. There's quite a lot of rules here. But the point is, anything with strength currently is worth a decent amount of money, and if you specifically end up hitting strength and intelligence, that is currently worth 50 div. All these split personalities have literally the same weighting, so you're just as likely to see a 50 div one as you are likely to see one that's not worth anything. Meaning, if you do enough simulacrums, and as you can see from the 20 simulacrums I did, I have 5 that I end up picking up. This is not all the split personalities I got. I end up getting maybe 10 or 15 total split personalities, but I only picked up the ones that are worth a div or higher. Everything else I just left on the ground. And since you basically almost see a split personality every single simulacrum, your chances of seeing one of these is pretty high, and you'll eventually, after maybe 20-30 simulacrums, have an unbelievably high chance to see one, and you'll most likely end up seeing one. Finally, the last thing to mention is the unique jewel Voices itself. There are 4 versions of Voices. We have the 7 passive variant, the 5 passive variant, the 3 passive variant, and the 1 passive variant. These become exceptionally more and more rare the further up the passives you go, and currently a 1 passive Voices, which doesn't even show up in PoE Ninja, is worth 1.5 mirrors. Now, I want to tell you that you are not going to see a 1 passive Voices. They are so rare that you will maybe see one every 2,000 to 3,000 simulacrums at best. As for 3 passive Voices, you might see a 3 passive Voices every 200 to 300 to 400 simulacrums, which at its current rates kind of effectively means you're making about a divine per map, just in a raw chance of you seeing a 3 passive Voices. But realistically, this isn't something that you should expect to see. And it's just more of a, if you end up hitting this, congratulations, you just made a lot of money. What I'm trying to point out here is that the 7 divs on average of consistent loot from simulacrums, or the 18 div an hour that you can expect, isn't the full picture. This is just the baseline of where you're going to be making on average if you are doing sims consistently. And On top of this, you have a very, very high chance of just getting a big ticket item that's worth 20, 30, 40, 50, even a mirror to just drop for you, which can massively boost your income and can be a really nice payout. Overall, I'm very happy with how Sims are doing right now. And their 1 div ticket price to be able to enter for 7 div worth of consistent loot is very much worth it. And in my opinion, is really, really good to do, especially if you have a build that is strong enough to be able to consistently do simulacrums. That's all for this video. If you have any other questions, please feel free to let me know in the comments below, or feel free to come by my Twitch. I stream every single day, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions there. Or if you just simply want to join all the cuties, I'll be more than happy to see you around. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you cuties in the next video.